Welcome back to our series called More Than. And what we're doing is we're looking at certain objects that are described in the Torah. Maybe it's a certain geographical location that is described as being very important. And sometimes we read them, or maybe we even do them. Maybe it's something like a mezuzah. It just says to put the commandments on our door, so we do. But we don't always understand what's underpinning that commandment, that there might be a really deep spiritual principle behind it, not just the simple fulfillment of it. And so while it's great just to obey out of faith, it's really wonderful when you know all the wonderful pictures that can go along with that obedience to the commandment. So just like with the mezuzah, once you know what it really means, then every time you come into your house or go out of your house, you can be encouraged that the Holy One is watching over you and all that goes with that, all that means to your family as a covenant family. So in this program, what we'd like to present to you is called More Than a Box. Yeah, More Than a Box. This is going to be part of the Shema, if you'll remember. The Shema, of course, is the basic statement of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? And then it goes on and it lists some specific things. And those specific things, of course, as we saw in another program, if you see this commandment in context with this commandment, then often this commandment can explain this one. And likewise, this commandment can explain this one. So let's reread the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and we'll see how that some of these commandments kind of being pushed in here into the same context have been used historically to help you understand a commandment sitting right beside it. So it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Remember the love part of that. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. So we see right here a little section. We've looked at the mezuzah at this point, and now we want to look at these commandments that are going to be bound on our hand. They're going to be bound as frontals on our forehead. What does one have to do with the other? Well, in the program on the mezuzah, we pointed out how the rabbis arrived at the positioning of a mezuzah on a doorpost. Remember, a mezuzah should be about 2/3 of the way up your door, about 1/3 of the way down on the right-hand side, and slightly angled in toward the house. So it's really pointing to two things. It's pointing to heaven above, but it's also pointing inside at the family that resides inside of there. How they arrived at that particular position is they looked at this commandment that's right next to it, where he says, you shall bind them on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your foreheads. Well, they say, if this is something that should be prominent, that people should be able to see it when you put it on, then having it right next door to the mezuzah commandment tells you that a mezuzah also should be in a prominent place of your house, even more than that, in a prominent place on your door frame, so that as a passerby glances towards your door, that they can see the mezuzah. As the person gets closer to your house, then the mezuzah is in a high, prominent place. So it's kind of like if you're going to put it in a prominent place on a human being, then the mezuzah should be in a prominent place on the doorpost of your house. Now, if you've ever seen the tefillin, you might have seen it translated as phylacteries in the Gospels. If you've ever seen them, they do look a little odd, especially if you've not been around Orthodox Jews before. They seem a little strange, like, why would you choose to do it that way? Well, we're going to look at why they chose to do it that particular way, and even going to break it down, like, what is it? When you look at those boxes, what's going on with them? The tefillin, they have a lot in common with your Passover Seder. I don't know if you realize that or not, because remember that Passover was designed also to be like a sign on your forehead. The scriptures put them together as something that can be considered kind of the same thing, that just as putting on the tefillin every day that has the commandments in it is a sign to anybody who sees you wearing those funny little boxes, when you keep the Passover, that sets you aside too. People will notice when you keep the Passover feast, and you will be set apart. You're kind of taking a conspicuous position in that respect, especially if, you know, the holiday you observe, which is Passover, is different from the holidays that they observe. You have an opportunity there to truly be a light to the nations. So another similarity between the Passover and the tefillin is that at a Passover Seder, if you've ever done the traditional Haggadah, then you know that the Seder itself goes in a particular order. It's always done the same. And so with that being parallel again to the tefillin, just as at the Passover Seder, you're going to drink 4 cups of wine or grape juice in a particular order. And then at the end of the Seder, you'll say the order of the Passover service is now completed correctly in accordance with all its ordinances and statutes. Well, the tefillin, it follows that same principle. Just like you drink the 4 cups of wine at the Passover, the tefillin box will have 4 sections. And each of those sections must follow a prescribed order. It's like a little Passover Seder in a box, if you want to think of it that way. And those 4 passages that will be on the parchments in these boxes, it's going to be Exodus 13, 1 through 10, Exodus 13, 11 through 16, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and Deuteronomy 11, 12 through 21. There's no deviation from that. It's very specific. And those scriptures are written on little scrolls. They're rolled up very tightly. And in the end, they'll kind of even be mashed once they're rolled up. And then there will be 4 compartments within the tefillin, and those parchments will be slipped into the 4 compartments of what is called the house. The house. So when you look at the box, the tefillin, the physical structure of the leather box, it's also referred to as a house. So you can see the similarity right there. You put a mezuzah on the doorpost of your house. The little tefillin, they're called beitim, or houses. And in the same way you put the parchment in the mezuzah, you're going to have 4 parchments with the salient scriptures in the compartments of that house. So it's like a 4-room house. And here in the graphic, you can see the tefillin. It's been unhinged from the bottom part that secures it. And you can see inside the house the 4 little rooms in the house, and you can see the 4 parchments. If you've never seen inside one before, it's very interesting. So we've also got, in terms of how one explains the other, we've got the order and the content of the service in the Haggadah. It is a Seder. It means we did this thing in order. Likewise, these tefillin, they have to be assembled and put on each day, except Shabbat. They're not put on Shabbat. but on the 6 weekdays, you put those on in a specific order. You don't just randomly start strapping things on. The Jewish male will have a specific order that he puts these on. The Haggadah that we use at a Seder, which tells us, it makes sure everything is in there so that we can fulfill all the commandments that pertain to Passover. But a Haggadah is a telling of the Exodus to the next generation. So that's what you're doing. Hagid is to tell. And you do that telling in specific steps, in a specific order. And you don't change that order year after year. It's repetitive, just like putting on the tefillin. You put those on repetitively, 6 days a week, however many weeks there are in a year. You never stop. It is suspended on Shabbat. But we see that the commandment to teach children the words is also joined to speak to them in the Shema. Right? You teach the children the words and you speak to them. So in that sense, when you put on the tefillin and you teach your children, it's like a Haggadah at Passover. It's going to be a repetitive telling of the Exodus story. In the terms of the tefillin, it's going to be a repetitive teaching of the Torah, of the Word of God. So how are these tefillin made? There are specialists who know exactly how to make them out of the animal hide. It has to be a kosher animal, obviously. And I've got a picture here in the graphic so you can see different points in the assembly process of how they would be put into kind of a rough mold and then to a more exacting mold to kind of get those 4 compartments in the house there. And then eventually, as it continues to form, then you'll see, of course, the finished work that might be put on it, because you can see the inside of it. It's still very rough leather. But on the exterior, it's very polished, looks very nice, very synagogue-worthy, very prayer-worthy if you're going into the presence of the Holy One to pray when you put on the tefillin. In ancient times, in the times of Yeshua, the tefillin were extremely small. In fact, some men wore them all day long. They were so tiny you really wouldn't notice them as anything more than a kind of a little headband. And I've got a picture here for you, but even looking at that picture, imagine them being very, very small. These are not really to scale. They would be very tiny. And imagine how tiny the little parchments would have to be. You can see the little parchments they uncovered inside this one. They're still rolled up in there. But the shape in ancient times was a little more rectangular. Once you open it up, then you can see a kind of a square or a box shape. But when it was folded over, then it becomes more of a rectangle. But you can still clearly see the 4 compartments of the house, even on the ancient tefillin. Now, after Yeshua resurrected from the dead, we know that lots of Jews became believers in Yeshua. And there is some literature out there. If that interests you, you can go to Creation Gospel Workbook 6. But just in a nutshell, what began to distinguish the Nazarene Jews from the Jews who didn't believe in Yeshua as the Messiah is that the Nazarene Jews were kind of known for wearing a different shape of the tefillin. They were in a kind of a cone shape. Like you can see, the picture's not great, but you can get the idea from the picture that they would have kind of looked like a little horn sticking up on top of their heads. But they say that's how you could distinguish them in prayer, because the Nazarenes would wear these round ones, and often they could be very highly decorated. Like they could have beautiful silver work around them, encased in them. And to this day, you can find highly decorated examples of tefillin. And of course, again, you've got the kosher animal hides. that the scriptures are going to be written on. It takes a scribe, it takes a sofer, someone who's expert in preparing these parchments to put them together, because just like we saw in the program on the mezuzah, you never want to put a letter in jeopardy of being mistaken for another letter by running them together too close, or by not leaving a good margin around where part of the letter would be chopped off. Because it could be something simple where maybe a dalet is a little bit run into something else, or maybe it's missing a little bit of a part there, and all of a sudden the dalet becomes a resh, or a chet becomes a he, and you can change the whole meaning of a sentence if that happens. And so we want to maintain the integrity of the word. And that's why you had scribes who specialized in knowing how to preserve the integrity of the text. And of course, they'll still use the old-fashioned bird feather, the quill pens, to do I guess we would call it calligraphy, that's associated with these parchments. It's interesting, though, that if you ever watch them do one, even though Hebrew is written from right to left, you'll see a scribe or a sofer, he will always print from the left to the right if he's right-handed, so he doesn't risk smearing the ink over. So it kind of forces him to write the wrong way in order, again, not to efface the letters or smear them up. So let's look at just a traditional New American Standard translation of Deuteronomy 11:19. It says, "You shall teach them to your sons." You could also say children there. "Talking of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." And what I have the red arrow pointing to there is a word in the Hebrew text that I think will help us get beneath the box here and help us understand why it's more than a box. It says, ledaber bam. Bam. Well, that's important, because where it says, "You shall teach them to your children," it's more literally saying to speak in them. Bam. And the idea here that just kind of sums it up, it says, you are teaching your children these commandments until you have truly spoken the commandments into them, into their inner being. You're penetrating into the spiritual realms of your child. And you continue teaching your children these commandments until they can speak the words themselves. In other words, it's become part of who they are. And it also says you should make a habit of quoting when you do this, when you teach the commandments. And you can use a phrase like, Moses taught us in the Torah. And one thing that would do is, again, it's like in the Exodus and the telling of the Exodus story in the Haggadah, you have to say, this is what happened to me when I came out of Egypt. You have to put yourself in the story. And so when you're teaching your children, you put yourself in the story. You say, Moses taught us in the Torah, as if you also were wandering in the wilderness with Moses for 40 years. Put your family in the story, and that makes a stronger connection with the kids. And so he will also begin to maybe mimic that pattern of speech, that sense of I was there. And if you will use that at those teachable moments that we all have, they will get used to hearing that. And if they hear like Moses taught us in the Torah, or Yeshua taught us about this commandment when he said, you can find catchphrases to insert so that they understand at that moment that you are referring them to the word to give them a point of reference for that life situation. You're grounding them. You're truly putting the rock under their feet, because you're giving a signal that says, I'm about to teach you how to deal with life from the Word. And then you will hear them also begin to do this. It becomes part of their natural pattern of speech, and therefore when they encounter difficult things in their lives, they can always think in their head, because you put it in there early, that my point of reference for this problem, I can go back and say, well, you know, Moses taught us in the Torah, or Yeshua taught us in the Gospels, or the prophets said, and such, and you've just kind of inscribed in them a wonderful pattern of how to deal with life. But the grammar and the text of the Shema suggests that teaching our children, it needs to be an ongoing, vibrant life in the Word. There's a mutual benefit both for the parent as a teacher, or the grandparent, or the aunt, or the uncle, or whoever that might be, who is teaching the child as they engage life situation. It says, first of all, teaching forces a person to study more intensively. You as the parent, if you don't know your stuff, kids will figure that out pretty fast. And then, once you teach the stuff, and you're teaching that pattern for the commandments as an answer to life situation, now what you're going to do with those children, once you've established the truth in them, you're going to open yourself to a charge of hypocrisy if you don't practice what you preach. They're like having little tzitzit flapping around your legs all day long, because if you don't practice what you've preached to them, they will speak up. Because children do spot hypocrisy a lot faster than grown-ups. And they will tell on you. And they will tell you. So it's like having a safeguard in place. You teach the commandment, and guess what? Now you've got some little accountability agents running around the house who will let you know pretty fast if you depart from the commandments that you're teaching. So we've got the children, it says, who will prolong their lives if they honor these commandments. And then it's also at the very same time motivating parents to improve their daily walk, which will also prolong their lives. Right? Which brings us to a section here in Deuteronomy 11, where it says, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied on the land, which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens are above the earth. So again, context. Teaching the children these commandments, putting them on the doorposts of your house. It has something about multiplying the days of your children. And it's connected to your fathers, which of course are going to be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Rashi points out in his commentary to chapter 11, verse 19, he says, to give you is not written here, but rather to give them. From here we find that we learn that the resurrection of the dead is from a source in the Torah. You know, think about Yeshua describing himself as the living word. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He says we would have expected the verse to say to give you. For it was those whom Moses was addressing who would take possession of the land, not the patriarchs about whom he was speaking. And therefore, what Rashi is saying here is that this particular verse is teaching us about the resurrection of the dead, because the point here is the same promise of resurrection that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the very same promise that's being given to your children. If they will embrace the covenant, if they will embrace these commandments. And so he's saying the children of Abraham, they will be resurrected. And they will, in person, receive the land. They will receive their inheritance. So what's the value of it's called laying tefillin. What's the value of putting the mezuzah on a door? What's the value of teaching the Torah to your children? It's more than just prolonging their life in a physical land. It's teaching those children how to acquire a spiritual eye and to always think of the land beyond the time of our death. It's a spiritual land It's concealed from the human eye, but nevertheless, it's there. And we will be resurrected to where we can interact equally as well with natural earth or the Garden of Eden that's hovering right above the land of Israel. And so by teaching them the word, you're revealing to them how to use that spiritual human eye and how to improve their vision with that spiritual eye, because they're putting the word literally between their eyes, one spiritual and one physical. And we've got two eyes. We should always be using a spiritual eye and a physical eye. What we know about these commandments, the statutes, the judgments, the commandments of the word, they were never just to set the conditions of living in a physical land and just carrying on life in a physical geographical location. They've always been preparation for living in the land of Israel in its elevated state. Because history tells us that if we rebel against the commandments, we don't live long in that land. We can't live long in that spiritual aspect of the land. Instead, we fall down into the natural land. And this is why we need the mercy. So let's look at a clue here. This is coming from the Torah portion, Va'et Chanan. If you're not familiar, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, they are separated into little reading sections, and these are called Torah portions, or parashiot. And each of them will have a name, typically based upon the first sentence or so of that section. So here's a section from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 11, and that portion is called Ve'echanan, which means, and I pleaded. And the root of that, the Hebrew understanding of that is, while Moses is pleading, he's pleading for favor. He's pleading for grace. And so the commandment to keep the commandments is found in a place where there is a plea for grace. Very appropriate that it would be in that particular Torah portion. It says, therefore you shall keep the commandment and the statutes and the judgments which I am commanding you today to do them. Right? And it's breaking down at this point 3 different types of commandments. Of course, the commandment we're more familiar with, which is a mitzvah. A mitzvah, plural would be mitzvot. Mitzvot. Those are commandments, like the Big Ten. And then there's another class, which is called a chok, or a statute. What falls into this category is typically commandments we don't really understand why. We're just told to do them. Like kosher eating, it's a chok. You don't really understand why. The red heifer is considered a chok. You don't really understand why. You will someday, but these are the true faith testers, because they don't always make rational sense. You need a lot of faith to keep a chok, because if you're leaning to your own understanding, you'll probably never engage them, because they won't make sense in a logical world. And then the third kind is going to be the mishpat, or the mishpatim would be plural, which is a judgment. But I wanted to show you how they're addressed in the very next Torah portion. Because Va'et, which has to do with grace and favor, where Moses is pleading for grace to enter into the promised land, it's kind of restating it in the very next verse, which begins a new Torah portion called Ekev. So Va'et, pleading for grace and mercy, says, therefore you shall keep the commandment and the statutes and the judgments which I am commanding you today to do them. And you'll notice that I went ahead and put in there the triple peh. It's a Hebrew letter peh, which means a mouth, and there's peh, peh, peh right after that. That's telling the scribe, okay, now you need to leave space right here. And then it goes into verse 12. And remember, these verses are artificial. They weren't there originally. Ekev says, then it shall come about, because you listen to these judgments and keep them and do them, that the Lord your God will keep you. He will keep with you his covenant and his loving kindness, which he swore to your forefathers, He will love you and bless you and multiply you. So we can see here it's kind of presenting to us the commandments with a little bit different shade between Va'etchanan and Ekev. So those three pes separate them even more. So you're getting similar information, but yet the text itself is telling us this is a little bit different from that. It's telling the scribe, leave this line open. Pe is a mouth, so it's kind of like an open mouth, the way that it's structured. And then when you see the pe, like that in the Hebrew text, it's short for petucha, which means open. And it looks like an open mouth, so it's pretty easy to remember. But both of these verses pretty much say the same thing. Why would they separate them by an empty line? Well, there is a little bit of a difference in the two verses. There's causality and there's type. So in verse 11, you have all three types of instructions, the mitzvah, the chok, and the mishpat. But verse 12 shifts a little bit. It talks about the mishpatim. And the mishpatim, if you had your little miniature law course in high school, you remember what a tort is. It has more to do with transactions and interactions between human beings. And so the mishpatim, they're the laws that regulate monetary transactions and interactions between people. It's how we do business with one another. Now keep that in the back of your mind, business. It's how we do business with one another. And it's thought that these laws are most often neglected and abused, or they will be twisted to serve the stronger party. And so the second one is saying, I want you to pay particular attention to the mishpatim, the torts, because there will be a temptation here. You might be tempted to consider the mishpatim lighter than the other commandments. You might place kosher eating up here, but maybe cheating on your taxes here because you don't like the king. But you can see how interactions between people might suffer a little bit compared to the ones that you feel like are directly between you and the Holy One. Your Shabbat observance, you might be scrupulous about that, but there might be a business transaction that you would be less scrupulous. And so one of the Jewish sages writes that being happy on holidays and learning Hebrew in order to teach the Torah to your children in the original language, these are wrongly considered light commandments. And they say that the temptation is to think, well, with these mishpatim, the way I treat other people, there's minimal reward. I'm not going to put that much emphasis on it. But they're saying that the way that these passages are separated, that according to Ekev, if you're a person who will place as much emphasis on the mishpatim as you do upon the mitzvot or the chukim, that you're a person who is pursuing a loving relationship with Adonai, that you're hanging on his every word, that to you, every word is precious, not just the ones that are the most convenient. So let's take another look at the causality, which goes to Torah portion Ekev. Ekev can be a little bit slippery in Hebrew because it can mean because, it can mean when, it can mean after. You can hear it in Jacob's name, Yaakov. And it's coming from a 3-letter root, which means the heel. And what does the heel do? It follows the intent of the foot. What does the foot do? It follows the intent of the heart and the head. So the idea here is because Israel listens to the mishpatim and guards them and does them, then Adonai will safeguard them and uphold the covenant and mercy. He will give them that mercy that they are pleading for. Because you're pursuing it with a heart of love, He is going to flood you with the mercy of his word. And that can make it sound as though good things are coming only through good works, which would, then we would know that, especially the Apostle Paul, he would say, well, that would make grace of no effect. But it's coming in the because verse. And so it's mentioning grace specifically right there so that you won't believe that good things only come through good works. That the causality there, it's encouraging you to seek that loving relationship with the Holy One. It's not asking you to confuse good works and grace, that they actually work together. And so how can we understand this better? Sometimes we can go to a Targum. And what a Targum is an Aramaic translation from the Hebrew. And because of when this translation was written, around the time of Yeshua, not only is it a similar language to the Hebrew, it's often explaining the Hebrew text to people who don't speak Hebrew. So that helps us. Of course, then we have to translate it into English from Aramaic. But often when that happens, what we see is in the Targum, we can find a better English word to help us understand it. And so for the Targum Onkelos, the translation is to listen or hear, right? As Kabbalat. Kabbalat. Don't confuse it with Kabbalah. Kabbalat, it's a noun construct of a very common Hebrew verb, which means to receive. If somebody gives me change at the grocery store, I would say, Ani mekabelet et hakesef. Right? It means I received it. I took it in my hand. I took possession of it. So listen and hear are translated as Kabbalat, or the receiving. And so what it's saying about the commandments here is, don't just have an auditory experience with the commandments. Don't just have a reading experience with the commandments. Instead, you are to try to consciously accept or receive the words as divine. Try to internalize them. And that is seen as accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And when you accept that yoke of the kingdom first, then you take upon the yoke of learning the commandments, right? You take upon that love, you take upon that pursuit first, of internalizing first, and then you can get down to, what we say is the brass tacks. Then you can get the fundamentals. How do I do this? When do I do this? Help me understand on the more physical level, what am I doing here? But they want first that you would accept that just trying to internalize the words first before you lift a finger to do it, try to understand it the best you can and just receive it as divine. And what the sages write is, grace can follow for one who tunes in and knows there is one God. And then he can love him and learn the Torah. And so you can see grace really is in the commandments. The expectation is that you will try to know him through those commandments, that you will pursue love through those commandments, and then you will begin to learn the commandments, the more practical things. And so Akev is teaching the causality of the blessing. It follows love. So Deuteronomy 11:13 says, it shall come about if you listen obediently, Shema tishme'u, to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, that he will give. Right? Do you hear that? Listening obediently. Right? Listening obediently, internalizing it, forming that relationship first. So many times we read a commandment, and before we ever even try to internalize it and find that relationship with him through it, We're trying to figure out exactly how we should be doing it. And he says, wait a minute, talk to me first. Sometimes we need to do that. We need to be able to, before we actually go do what Dad told us to do, if we don't have a relationship with Dad, we might misunderstand the words and then go do something that Dad really didn't tell us to do. But when we get to know him, it's much easier to go out and do what he's asking us to do. So they say the little things, even the less rewarding things, these can create a very deep relationship. Anybody can hear the big stuff, but it's the little stuff. They compare it to a marriage where a husband and wife, they're so close that they can hear the little things, and that blessing and mercy will follow in a marriage like that that's based on love for one another. I mean, wouldn't it be pretty sick if a spouse wanted the other spouse to serve him or her out of obligation and not out of love? Well, Adonai is our king, but he does want us to love him. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. You see how loving is preceding the details? Loving him is going to transform those details for you, because when we love, obedience follows. And so that's what you'll find out. Sometimes people cannot comprehend why you keep the commandments, even the little ones. And they'll accuse you of trying to earn righteousness. They'll accuse you of doing it out of obligation or to earn a reward. They'll tell you it's pointless. They might even tell you it's wicked. I had that this morning. But they really cannot see the close relationship that you have formed between the spiritual and the physical realms of the commandments, that you have actually become sensitive to your husband. So no commandment's too small to listen to. No commandment is too small to accept. Rabbi Kahn pointed out Adam didn't sin because he listened to his wife, which means just literally heard, an auditory experience. He sinned because he accepted mekabel. He allowed the fruit in. He accepted it, therefore he did it. And so this is what the Shema is asking us to do. Accept it. Accept it. Then do it. Right? So loving your neighbor, it's like loving Adonai with all your heart, which is the Shema. It says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and the strength. It's a covenant of kindness. It's a covenant of mercy. And so Yeshua says, linked to how you love the Father is linked to how you love your neighbor. You accept him or her. You receive him or her. Remember Yeshua saying, if you receive one of these little ones in my name, you form a relationship, not begrudgingly, not to get a reward or just because God said so, but because you genuinely want to form unity within the body of Messiah, and then the blessing and the mercy will follow. Rabbi Twersky says a mitzvah, it's more than a command. It's also betzavta, which means togetherness. He says every mitzvah is a point of connection between he who commands and we who are commanded. The result of fulfilling a mitzvah is togetherness. So while all good deeds will ultimately be rewarded, not all of them will result in a relationship with God. And that kind of explains how the sages say the wicked prosper, at least they seem to. Because no matter how wicked, human beings all do a little bit of good in their lives. And so Adonai is fair. He's going to reward everyone. So he says the wicked, they'll get their full reward in this life for any good they've done. But they're going to receive nothing in the world to come. Their relationship was with themselves. See, the good deed there that's being performed, it's not bonding them to the Holy One, it's actually bonding them to themselves. And so with us, we want that good deed to bond us with Adonai, not with ourselves. There's no point in that, because ultimately there's no relationship that grows out of that. You're just having a relationship with yourself. But you want the commandment to be that thing that links you and chains you and is like a rope that both the Holy One and you are holding on to together. If you've ever seen a Jewish wedding, you know what I'm talking about. So there is a specific way of putting on the tefillin. When they go on the head, of course, they're going to go on the soft part of the head, where when a baby's born, it's not quite closed up yet. So it's thought that this is going to be the place where the commandments can really sink in that soft space. And then on the arm, you'll put the box on the bicep of the arm, and then you'll take 7 wraps down the forearm. You'll go around the hand, and then ultimately you'll make some rings around your finger with the straps. And so when the tefillin takes that last loop around the middle finger, they say this blessing, which is a marriage blessing, by the way. It's, I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know the Lord. And then we've got this next verse here. Remember the blessing from a kev that promises blessings for hearing and for loving Adonai. Hosea 2:19, it says, it will come about in that day that I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine, and to the oil. And so it's showing here the relationship, the unity. When you put on the tefillin, it's like putting on, it's like having a little wedding once a day. And then we see Yeshua. He's teaching the same thing, that the commandments, putting on the commandments is a matter of love. He says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive. Remember, it's something to be received. The Kabbalat, the Mekabelet. You receive it in first. Whom the world cannot receive because it does not see him or know him. But you know him because he abides with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. After a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me because I live and you will live also. In that day, you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. Yeshua is just shouting this message of the love relationship built through the commandments. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will disclose myself to him. And Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, what then has happened that you're going to disclose yourself to us and not to the world? Yeshua answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. See the causality there? If he loves me, he will keep my word. He will receive me first. He will seek the relationship with me through that commandment first, and then he will keep it. And my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. Remember, the little boxes are called the Beitim. They're called houses. And Yeshua says, we will come to him and make our abode with him. We'll set up house, which is what the form of tefillin is. It's a house. He who does not love me does not keep my words. And the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. These things I have spoken to you while abiding with you. But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I said to you. So Yeshua is like our parent. He's saying, I'm going to make sure that I teach you. And if I'm not physically here, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit to teach you so that you can receive me in love. And so this is the viewpoint that the Jewish sages are teaching from the Torah portion at Kev. Love, listen, accept, receive, and learn. Then do. Make a house for the deeds in the spirit of the word. And all this means is live in anticipation of the resurrection of the dead to the garden. You are preparing for a new home. And in return, Yeshua says the Father's going to practice what he preaches. He'll make sure that he teaches you and he offers you this relationship because he's going to send the Holy Spirit to make sure that that happens. So they're more than little boxes. You can tell. Man always needs a sign of his bond with the Holy One, with the one who created him. The Sabbath itself, that's a sign. But on the weekdays, the sign is the tefillin. It's the little boxes that we put on the arm and the forehead. Coming from the Song of Songs, the Midrash says, "It is written, set me for a seal on your heart, as a seal on your arm." That's exactly where the little box rests for the arm. It rests on your bicep. And the way that it points on the bicep, it points toward the heart. So he puts this seal of the commandments on your heart. And what connects you to him? The commandments itself in the little box. But we know that these commandments were never an earned righteousness. Even the words of the Torah, they get a bad reputation for thinking you can earn grace with works, but the Torah itself shows you that's not true. Deuteronomy 6:25 says, "It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all this commandment before the Lord our God, just as he commanded us." See, it's not your righteousness. It's the Father's righteousness. It's righteousness for you. He lets you put on his clothes. Deuteronomy 7:7. It says, "The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you are more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers." So you never earned it. It wasn't an earned righteousness. It wasn't an earned love. It was completely unearned. But then you had to make a choice. Deuteronomy 8:16 says, "In the wilderness he fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do good for you in the end. Otherwise you might say in your heart, 'My power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth.' But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you the power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant which he swore to your fathers." Well, the idea here is he's going to decide what you eat. The commandments are the food you eat. And when you eat the commandments, you're eating humble pie repeatedly. This is the whole point of the commandments, to humble us. And he says, "I'm going to feed you the food you need. And therefore the blessing originates with me." You're never going to be able to keep these commandments and say it was your righteousness. No, what you're supposed to realize in eating this manna of the word is that this is how I have chosen to bless you, not because of the works of your hand. Which brings us again to the tefillin that are going to help us understand the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation. Because remember, 666 is that number that throws fear into everyone, and it shouldn't. Because the big number of Revelation is 7. Which should throw a lot of fear into some people. But it is a number of completion and perfection. But we have to deal with day 6 before we can deal with day 7. We have to deal with what distinguishes man and beast on the 6th day before we can enter into Shabbat rest on the 7th. So in Nehemiah 10:31, we get a clue. If we're concerned about what Revelation says about buying and selling, it says he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. All right, that's like the biggest clue in the Bible. Go back to day 6 if you want to understand what's happening here. And it has to do with conforming to the image of the beast, the most cunning beast of the field, versus conforming to the image of Elohim. And when you're confused about that, then you will conform to the image of the beast. You will have his mark instead of the seal of the Holy Spirit, instead of the seal of the commandments on your heart, instead of this seal of Passover and the blood of the Lamb. So in the time of Nehemiah, remember the Jews had come back. They're trying to rebuild Jerusalem. They're trying to rebuild the temple. And they've acquired some bad habits. They've started allowing people to bring goods to sell on Shabbat, and they're buying it. He says, as for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day. And we will forego the crops the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. See what he's pointing out here? It's buying and selling on Shabbat. That's the problem. And so when you see the buying and the selling as conditional upon having the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation, it's pointing you back to the prophets so that you'll have an interpretive tool here and say, wait a minute, the mark of the beast in the big picture would be somebody asking me to violate a commandment that is clear, has been clear from the creation, from the 7th day of the world. It's that clear. It's not going to be, oops, is this the mark of the beast? Or might it be the mark of the beast? I'm afraid it won't be any of that. You'll know it's the mark of the beast because it's clearly asking you to deviate from a commandment of love. And he says the context here is the Shabbat and the feast days, the holy days. It's something inside you that wants to buy or sell, engage in commercial activity on the Shabbat and the feast days. That is going to be the mark of the beast, because every day is just like the other to the beast. You have to make the beast rest on the 7th day. He'll be just as glad to work as not. And when we're just as glad to work as not on the Shabbat, then what does distinguish us from a beast? So that takes us again back to the Shema. You know, he says, you shall teach them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. And here's the one we're concerned with. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now this answer is in plain sight, and it has to do with the tefillin. You would put these on 6 days a week if you were a Jewish male. You couldn't run away from the significance of it, right? He doesn't conceal things from us. He puts them in plain sight, which is how many people miss it. The tefillin are hinting to 2 things: the letter of the Torah and the ruach. Remember, Yeshua said, I'll send the Holy Spirit to teach you. The head tefillin, it has a normal Hebrew letter shin on one side, but on the other side, it has a 4-pronged shin. A Hebrew letter shin is normally formed from 3 Hebrew letter vavs, which a Hebrew letter vav has a value of 6. So you put vav, 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 and they're joined at the bottom. Therefore, a Hebrew letter shin is a 666. Which is, again, it's associated with fire, right? Esh. But that's not the end of the story. It's more than a box. It's more than a letter. Remember, it's about the ruach. It's about the spirit. So when we put on the tefillin, it's like that Shabbat sign. It's like that mishpat. It's binding us in love, not obligation. People see a Jewish male putting on the tefillin, and typically what they'll see is bondage. They'll see obligation. But if you've put it on properly, what you see is you're being bound to your bridegroom in love, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness. But if we don't have that relationship, then it'll very quickly move from the spirit of the Torah to the letter. Amos 8:4 describes the characteristics of when this happens. He says, hear this, you who trample the needy, to do away with the humble of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, so that we may sell grain? And the Sabbath, that we may open the wheat market, to make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales, so as to buy the helpless for money and the needy for a pair of sandals, and that we may sell the refuse of the wheat. You see the buying and selling context there? It's in the context of Shabbat. Remember the black horse of Revelation riding out the rider? He has the scales in his hand, and he's talking about the barley and the wheat. These aren't random symbols in the book of Revelation. It's pointing you back to the things you've already learned. And so in these examples of Nehemiah and Amos, which have to do with the mark of the beast, buying and selling on Shabbat or the holy days, is that business is at the heart of it. Because remember, they said the mishpatim, they have a lot to do with business transactions, and they're usually regarded very lightly. We cut corners often on our business transactions. He says, if you'll keep these, it's demonstration that you're pursuing a love relationship with the Holy One, because they're not light to you. You're hanging on his every word. And so if you're keeping Shabbat grudgingly, because you want to get back to your own business, then you've completely missed it. And Amos, he goes on with that prophecy of destruction and exile for people who don't have the spirit of the Torah. They're hypocrites. They're without love. They're trampling all over the needy. And to them, Shabbat is just an interruption to all their buying and selling. When it was never about that. The commandments, Deuteronomy 5:10, it says, showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. They love me first, and then they keep my commandments. If you don't love him first, then it will never be anything more than a mark of the beast. So pay special attention right here to the 4 prongs on the sheen, how it's a little bit different from the normal Hebrew letter sheen. See the 4 prongs there? You've got vav, 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 vav instead of vav, vav, vav. So you would have 6666 instead of 666, because this side of the box represents the spirit, the ruach of the commandments. Remember, it's about the beitim, it's about the houses and inviting the Holy Spirit into your house. And that sheen, it stands for Shaddai, that nurturing, mothering aspect of the Holy One. It's even physically etched into Jerusalem by its valleys. The Hebrew letter Shin is cut in to Jerusalem. He is the all-sufficient one. You don't have to buy and sell on Shabbat or the holy days. He will provide for you. He is that Shin, El Shaddai. So you see how the letter, just the mere letter, 666, represents just the natural, the physical. But if we look at the 6666, if we look at the 4-pronged Shin, it represents the spiritual light of the Torah. And so if we look at just the 3 Vav Shin, we're looking at pretty much empty beast skins. It's like there's nothing in the box. But if you take the box and the spirit of the Torah is inside of it, now you have a whole house. Now you have a relationship. And if you put the 3 Vavs with the 4 Vavs, how many do you end up with? 7. You get a full menorah, which represents the 7 spirits of Adonai. It represents the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of understanding, the spirit of counsel, the spirit of power, the spirit of knowledge, and the spirit of reverence. You get the letter and the spirit of the word. And so what do those 4 prongs represent? They represent the backlight that would be formed as it shined through the 3 prongs of the normal sheen. In other words, we would call it white space. The light shines through those lattices. It kind of forms a pattern there. And so as the light shines from behind it, then you would look at the light that fills in between, and that represents the spiritual aspect of the commandments, the 4-pronged sheen. And if you do that, if you use backlight and you kind of throw it up onto a curtain here, which one of our students did, you can literally see that backlight shining through that menorah. And you can see the fullness of the Spirit and the letter of the Torah. So that Hebrew letter Shin, it's linking the tefillin because of the backlight aspect of it. Again, with the priestly blessing. In Numbers 6:22, it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, Thus you shall bless the sons of Israel. You shall say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall invoke my name upon the sons of Israel, and then I will bless them." Well, again, the traditional practice is you don't look at the priest when he does the blessing, because you're acknowledging he's not the source. The source is the Holy One, and he's simply the mouthpiece. The light's just shining through him as he speaks these words to you. And often they'll even cover themselves with a prayer shawl to make sure they remember. Don't look at the person. Focus on the one it's connecting you to, just like with the commandments. So the priest will bless, and they'll hold their hands in a particular way. And the way that they hold their hands, it will form at least 2-letter sheens with their fingers. They can also put the hands together and form extra sheens with the white space. And somehow in this mysterious way, they're placing the sacred name upon Israel, the all-sufficient one. He'll take care of everything. Again, it stands for El Shaddai. And so as you look at the graphic there, and there's variations on this, of course, sometimes they'll form a triangle with their fingers as well. But the idea is what's shining through those fingers is just as important as the fingers themselves. The spirit of the Torah is just as important as the letter of the Torah itself. And so the idea is, as the priests are standing before the ark, when they recite this blessing, that Adonai himself, represented by that word that's behind them, they stand in front of the ark so that the Torah scrolls are behind them in the ark. And the idea is that it's Elohim himself, represented by that word, looking out at the congregation from the ark. So in effect, just by this arrangement, they're saying, hey, look, the Holy One himself is the one blessing you. I'm holding up physical fingers, but his presence, his spirit is what's shining through. His divine presence will descend and stand in the congregation. So it's thought that in the time of the temple, that he blessed them through his windows. You know, the Song of Songs says, you know, he's standing at the window, he's peering through the lattices. Well, they said in temple times, these were better times. And we experienced his presence more directly because he's looking at us through the window, the light of his countenance through the windows. But now that we're in exile, he's peering through the lattices. And these are formed by the fingers of the Kohanim when they bless Israel. His divine presence is still there, and it can still be found in his word, in a relationship. So, what do we want to do? We want to remember what's represented by those little boxes. We should never fall into a spiritual slumber. We shouldn't disengage and simply check off our own boxes as obligation, because the Holy One, he's always standing there. He's never left us. He's still standing there. And he's waiting for us to return to his Shabbat. He's waiting for us to return to his appointed times, and not to do it out of obligation, like, oh my goodness, I didn't get something at the store. When will Shabbat be over so I can go get it? Well, when will Shabbat be over so I can have my recliner and my DVR? And no. If that's the relationship, there's just not much there. But he says, if you will pursue me in love first, get to know me that way, then you're going to keep those commandments. And they're going to stick, because these are the things that'll bind us together as husband and wife, because he has betrothed us in righteousness. He has sealed us with the seal of his Holy Spirit. We are set as a seal upon his arm. And so when we see the little boxes, the tefillin, on the arms of someone praying, it's a reminder to everyone that yes, just as we have set him as a seal upon our arms, we are also set as a seal upon his. So I hope that gives you a little bit better insight as to what's in those little boxes and why it's way more than just a box.